Most evangelicals grow up with a simple assumption that feels almost self-evident, that the Bible is our sole authority. It sounds faithful, it sounds cautious, and it sounds like the safest possible way to ensure we are not led astray. But once we slow down and examine what that claim actually entails, historically, biblically, and logically, it begins to unravel rather quickly. This is not a rejection of Scripture. It is a question about whether sola scriptura, Scripture alone as the Church's final rule of faith, has ever actually been how Christianity functioned. To begin with, the earliest Christians did not have a Bible. They did not possess a New Testament. They did not own personal copies of Scripture. And most of them were not literate in any case. What they had was the Old Testament, read publicly when available, alongside apostolic preaching, catechesis, communal worship, and appointed leaders. Christianity spread for generations through proclamation, imitation, discipline, and shared life, long before anything resembling a bound Bible existed. If sola scriptura is meant to be the Church's foundational operating principle, then the Church spent its formative centuries without access to the very thing it supposedly requires. That does not mean Scripture was unimportant or unauthoritative. It means the Church's authority structure was not Scripture alone. This becomes even clearer when we consider how the Bible itself came into being. The New Testament did not arrive as a finished collection. For several centuries, different churches used different sets of texts. Some books were widely accepted early on, others were disputed, and still others were rejected. The canon emerged gradually through use, recognition, and judgment within the Church. Evangelicals often respond by saying the Church did not create the canon, but merely recognized it. That distinction is important, but it does not solve the problem. Recognition still requires authority. By what authority did the Church's recognition become binding? And why should that recognition bind Christians today? If the Church that made it was fallible and divided, if the Church had no authority to definitively identify Scripture, then our certainty about the Bible's boundaries becomes fragile. If the Church did have that authority, then Scripture was never standing alone in the first place. Either way, sola scriptura depends on something it cannot itself supply. There is a deeper irony here. The Bible is a record of people who themselves had no Bible. The New Testament documents apostles teaching orally, churches being governed, disputes being resolved, doctrines being clarified, and communities being disciplined, all before a finalized New Testament existed. The apostolic faith was transmitted through preaching, confession, and practice, not through private textual study. It's often assumed that once this teaching was written down, it became the sole binding authority. But Scripture never actually says this. The idea that apostolic authority would become exclusively written, and that no binding authority would continue in the Church beyond the text, is assumed rather than demonstrated. Which brings us to the uncomfortable point. Sola Scriptura itself is not taught in Scripture. Scripture tells us that Scripture is inspired, authoritative, profitable, and necessary. It does not tell us that Scripture is the only binding authority Christ left to his Church. Appeals to "it is written" or to the dangers of corrupt tradition establish the authority of Scripture, not its exclusivity. The doctrine of sola scriptura is an extra-biblical principle, and that means it fails its own test. Paul's letter to the Romans sharpens this further. He explicitly teaches that people may lack the law, lack Scripture, and yet still be judged justly by God. Salvation and moral accountability are not dependent on textual possession. That does not diminish Scripture's authority, but it does expose the distance between the evangelical slogan and the lived reality of Christianity. Faith has always been formed through preaching, conscience, community, and encounter, not through isolated Bible reading. Evangelicals usually respond by clarifying that sola scriptura is not about what is necessary for individual salvation, but about the Church's final doctrinal authority. But this is where the principle collapses in practice. When two sincere Christians disagree, both citing Scripture, who decides? The Bible cannot decide without interpretation. The Spirit cannot be appealed to as an arbiter because both sides claim that guidance. And the claim that essentials are clear simply relocates the problem to defining what counts as essential, a matter on which Christians plainly disagree. In reality, the final authority becomes the individual or the local community or an inherited tradition that no one is willing to name as tradition. Scripture remains central, but it is not alone. The canon itself cannot be derived from Scripture alone. A binding interpretation cannot be derived from Scripture alone, which means that evangelical sola scriptura typically functions as Scripture plus private judgment plus unacknowledged tradition. This is not humility. It is simply authority that refuses to identify itself. None of this is an argument against Scripture. Scripture is inspired. Scripture is authoritative. Scripture is indispensable, but historically, biblically, and logically, Scripture was never meant to function as the Church's sole rule of faith, detached from the community that received it, preserved it, proclaimed it, and lived it. Christianity did not begin with a book. It began with a people, a proclamation, and an authority that preceded the text and gave rise to it. Sola scriptura sounds faithful, it sounds safe, but it is not how Christianity started, and it is not how it has ever actually worked. The real question is not whether Scripture is authoritative. The real question is whether Scripture was ever meant to stand alone.